Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third and final talk of the Stained Glass Museum's autumn series. As people are joining, I will welcome you all. Please let us know in the chat where you are joining us from. I'm sure we've got people from across the UK and perhaps further afield. It's my pleasure to welcome you all this evening. My name is Jasmine Allen and I'm the director and curator of the Stained Glass Museum. And we have a fantastic talk lined up for you this evening on a topic that is very little known about. Lisbeth Langouche, who I will introduce shortly, is going to speak to us this evening about plain glazing. And it's something that perhaps you don't think of when we think of stained glass automatically. Joining this evening's talk and all of the talks for the Stained Glass Museum's series does directly support the unique museum that is in Ely and its fantastic collection. So thank you very much for supporting us in this way. I'm going to introduce our speaker in a minute, but before I do, I wanted to just say a bit more about this topic because, as I said, we're a collection of stained glass, and tonight we're going to be talking about plain glass windows. However, the two are not directly opposed to one another, and actually the history of stained glass certainly includes leaded windows, ornamental windows, which may not have any figurative design or any paint. This is a very early example from our collection. Some of you will be familiar with it from the early 13th century. And this is a panel we call a grisaille panel because it's mostly made of clear or what we call white glass. There's a bit of colour in it too, but actually most of this window is clear glass, and it's a pattern that's made in this lead, quite an intricate pattern that even in the 13th century, ornamental plain glass was part of the stained and decorative glass that our museum celebrates the history of. And I wanted to also share with you some couple of modern examples which are actually recent acquisitions to the collection, which also show how our collection does sometimes think about this idea of ornamental leaded windows. This is a leaded tracery light, probably from the Halifax area in Yorkshire. We think that because this kind of distinctive lacework leaded pattern was quite popular in that area, especially in the Commonwealth era, actually, although this is a later example from the late 19th or early 20th century. And it came from a church tracery light at the very top. So again, this is clear glass held together with lead. But as you can see, the leading is actually a very complex pattern, and it gives us this ornamental quality. And then finally, a bit of colour in this window, but again, it's a window that's mostly made of the pattern of leadwork, and it is, of course, an Art Nouveau window by a Belgian artist, Louis de Contigny. Actually, this is not a window, I'm calling it a window. It's two doors that would have opened up. So thinking about the kind of domestic importance of decorative plain and leaded glass. And I hope some of those pieces were of interest to you and whet your appetite for a more focused discussion of the topic by our speaker, Lisbeth Langouche, who I will ask to come back on the screen now. Lisbeth, please do turn your video on. There we go. Good evening and welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Lisbeth Langouche is actually joining us from Ghent in Belgium this evening. So we're really lucky to have such an international speaker via this online talk. And after finishing her studies in art history at Ghent University, Lisbeth went on to study the conservation of stained glass at Antwerp. And since then has been researching the historical importance of window glass, and recently completed her PhD at the University of Antwerp, looking at clear window glass in the Low Countries in the period from the late 15th century up to the late 19th century, which is a long period, but the fact that very little is written about this at all does demonstrate how important studies like that are. Tonight, her talk is focused on a single manuscript, which I think will give us more insight into the history of plain and leaded glass. So Lisbeth, please feel free to share your screen.
Yes.
And over to you.
Okay. Like this. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Indeed, my name is Lisbeth Langouche, and I finished my PhD in June this year. This PhD was all about clear window glass, the different types of clear window glass that were available, produced here, and here are the Low Countries. And also how these different types of window glass were applied differently. And during my research, I came across a manuscript, the Ulrix manuscript. It was about clear glass, so I was interested to know more about it. And well, together with my colleague, I wrote a little book about it. And about this side project, I will give you a talk this evening. So I have never been in Ely, in the Museum of Ely, and I thought, well, you know, the main focus is, well, colorful stained glass. But as I told you, my presentation will be all about leaded windows executed with clear glass. And I will talk about geometrical lead patterns, about their evolution throughout the ages, and how this is connected to the evolution of the glazier's job. But I can already give away that will also be some references to stained glass. Well, as I told you, the initial reason to make this presentation is this curious manuscript that was sold at auction in Brussels some years ago. It was described as a pattern book for clear leaded windows, probably originating from the city of Tongeren, which is located in what is now known as the province of Limburg in Belgium. And on this map, I will hide myself. Yes, on this map, you see the geographical situation around 1700 and how Tongeren here is located near Liège and Maastricht. The manuscript itself also dates from around 1700, as it was probably made in the late 17th century. It contains 77 drawings representing geometrical patterns of leaded windows. Part of these regards repeated motifs, as we still see them in churches and other monuments, but a considerable part of the drawings represents something else, and they are examples of glazier's masterpieces. According to 2 handwritten entries, the drawings were made by a certain Severinus Ulrix, who was a glazier from Tongeren, and that is why the book is now called the Ulrix manuscript. Besides this Ulrix manuscript, I have knowledge of 3 similar sets of drawings originating from the southern Low Countries. Of course, this number is very low, so we can safely say that we are dealing here with something special, with a rare type of source. Most interesting is that some of the designs recur in several or in all of these sets, which suggests a certain connection between the sets, maybe thanks to traveling glaziers. But it is also remarkable that they all date from the same period, the 17th, 18th centuries. And this is probably no coincidence. As I will explain, this period saw some important evolutions in the history of glazing. The market for stained and leaded windows changed, which was reflected in the glazier's job as well as in the guild's practices. So therefore, next to communicating about the existence of the Ulrix manuscript, I take this occasion to dig deeper into the system of the glazier's guilds and the masterpieces, but I will start by giving an overview of the historical evolution of the non-painted leaded glass windows. Beyond any doubt, the Cistercian abbeys hold a unique position in this history, as they are known for their beautiful clear glass leaded windows with elegant designs. And known examples are those in France of Pontigny, Aubazine, and Bonlieu, which are all dating from the 12th century. Each of these sites is an illustration of the variation and beauty of the early non-painted leaded window. For the purchasers, these windows must have been quite a cost. Even though stained glass windows would have been even more expensive, it stays a fact that in the Middle Ages, glazing was a prerogative of the nobility and the church. This was also the situation as it existed in the Low Countries, and this would not change until the second half of the 15th century. From then on, the window glass spread further, including into the houses of the common citizens. And moreover, my own recent study has shown how glazing became noticeably cheaper from the early 16th century onwards. For instance, on paintings can be seen how this window glass was integrated in homes. It was assembled with lead canes to form leaded panels. And a first method was a panel composed of small crown glass discs of about 10 centimeter diameter. And several 15th century Flemish painters have depicted this kind of windows. But as material evidence of this type of glazing is rare in this region, it is assumed that other patterns were more common here. The first of which was the losange pattern. And then a following type consisted of square panes and is attested since at least the late 15th century. And then in the 16th century, a new type emerged, being the so-called Flemish Renaissance pattern. Of course, in all these leaded panels, stained glass roundels could perfectly be integrated. And many buildings were indeed decorated with such roundels, which were produced on a large scale in the 15th to 17th centuries, but also after that. However, various developments in the 17th century would eventually undermine the supremacy of the leaded panel and cut back the demand in painted roundels. Important was that leaded panels were increasingly regarded as old-fashioned after the introduction of a new window design, making use of glass panes held between wooden glazing bars. This glazing system no longer needed leaded panels, which moreover made it less obvious to insert roundels in these windows. In addition to this, the art of stained glass went through hard times. After iconoclasm and under the impulse of the Contra-Reformation, more churches were glazed with clear glass. But also, in domestic architecture, the same austerity spread. Illustrative of this is what the Dutch engineer Simon Stevin wrote, and I quote, "Regarding decoration of glass windows, I prefer no decorative painting on them because this reduces the light." And the Dutch art theorist Wilhelmus Fauré shared this opinion and even mocked the colorful windows of former times. And he wrote, "In the past, the painted windows were foolishly and redundant in use. Most glass windows in churches and houses were that medley smeared that one could barely see the heavenly light through them." And then also the French architect André Philibien applauded the advantage of clear glass in private houses, where one could simply not have enough daylight. So they all wanted their interior illuminated by as much pure, uncolored light as possible. And here you have a painting that is illustrative of what would become very fashionable in the 18th century, namely bright rooms where the sunlight could enter freely through large windows, which were glazed with large panes of glass, or panes that were as large as possible. Everybody who desired a modern house with a modern interior had such so-called French windows. All this meant a shift in orders for both glass painters and the glaziers. On the one hand, the demand for stained glass windows, and most of all monumental stained glass windows, had dropped. On the other hand, the glazier's job had diversified. From now on, they delivered and installed the glass panes in the modern all-wooden windows besides making and installing clear glass leaded windows. As before, part of these leaded windows followed simple patterns, but glaziers were equally asked to compose more complex, more elaborate leaded panels. And for instance, the pattern on this painting is identical to one of the patterns on this drawing. And this drawing represents the motifs used for the 17th century windows in Park Abbey in Heverlee near Louvain. And here we see another preliminary design next to the central part of an executed window surrounded with clear glass. Each window in the cloister of Park Abbey was adorned with a scene from the life of Saint Norbert. And as you can see, attention was not only given to the painted central zone, the clear glass leaded frame as well was considered important. And for each window, another fancy lead pattern was chosen. And further, we only have to think of the many 17th and 18th century churches and other monuments whose windows showed similar geometrical motifs to understand how popular such elegant clear glass panels were. Interesting is how this whole evolution is also visible in the glaziers guilds practices. And in the southern Low Countries, glaziers guilds are attested since the 14th century. In order to regulate the glazier's craft, to guarantee production quality, and to control economic competitions, these guilds had two important instruments: the obligatory apprenticeship, by which a pupil would be trained at a master's workshop, and this during several years. And then secondly, the masterpiece, through which a candidate had to prove his competence in order to become a master himself. The oldest known references to the masterpiece in the southern Low Countries date from the late 15th century. For example, this is an extract from the Tournai Guild Ordinance of 4080, and which said that a candidate could choose what test to make. Either he made a stained glass panel, either he made a clear glass leaded panel. It was not specified what this clear glass leaded panel exactly had to look like, but comparison of other guilds' ordinances gives some useful insights. It seems that at first this non-painted leaded panel was quite simple and was composed of diamond quarries, square-shaped panes, or a diced pattern. For instance, in Amsterdam in 1553, the glazier's test was a panel of white glass in a diamond quarry or square-shaped pattern, while their colleagues in Ghent had to create a losange panel, which from 1600 onwards changed to a panel with a diced leading pattern. But as the 17th century progressed, the masterpiece became more complex, and ordinances spoke of star-shaped motifs, of right-angled pieces, and of so-called hold pieces. And especially these right angles and hold pieces are indeed difficult to cut without breaking the glass. And these are recurring characteristics in the masterpieces from then on. And just a quick word in between about these right-angled pieces and the hold pieces, so you know what I mean by these terms. And here you have a fragment of an executed leaded panel in which there are a lot of right-angled pieces. And these yellow lines accentuate some of these right angles. But as you can see, these right angles are particularly vulnerable at the outside. And here, the red flashes highlight where the glass pieces are broken. So also, while cutting these pieces, the glazier had to be very careful and most of all, very experienced. And here you have a late 15th century panel in which the glazier did a really difficult and good job with cutting out holes in a piece of glass without breaking it. And more precisely, you have to look at the head of the blue monster. This is made by using one large piece of glass, like this, in which are cut out both the eyes in order to fill these holes with red glass. And then when we return to this slide, you have probably noticed that the left picture is another example of a hold piece. And possibly This shield was once part of a masterpiece. In any case, references were found to this kind of work, such as the following specification in the Guild Ordinance of Alost. The glaziers test consists of a shield in one piece of glass, and in that same shield, 3 little shields have to be made without breaking the glass, the whole forming the coat of arms or shield of St. Luke. Here you see the shield again. Anyway, the following pictures show 3 historical examples of executed masterpieces in which we can discern a similar shield besides other hold pieces and, again, many pieces cut with right angles. They all date from the 18th century, and the first is kept at the Musea Brugge in Bruges, the second at the Museum M in Louvain. And here you don't see the shield of St. Luke, but the shield of the city of Louvain. And then the third masterpiece is kept at the Museum Lakenhal in Leiden. The difficulty level of the glaziers test had clearly risen, as this type of masterpiece required excellent skills in glass cutting and leading. Meanwhile, it seems that a distinction had arisen in the 16th century between the glaziers and the glass painters, because from then on, the name or title glass painter appears in the guild's text. So there was some kind of institutionalization of the 2 disciplines, meaning that a glazier was no longer automatically a glass painter and vice versa. Therefore, it seems that this increased specialization resulted in higher standards of competence. And furthermore, in the 17th century, references to glass painting disappeared from the glaziers' guild's ordinances. And when you come to think of it, it seems strange that glaziers had to make such a difficult test, whereas more and more clients wanted simple types of glazing, and the all wooden window became increasingly popular. And a hypothesis is that the glaziers may have wanted to manifest their skill, their craftsmanship, to show that they were able to do more than just making simple everyday window panels. Moreover, as such, they may have wanted to distinguish themselves from the glass painters, and they may have wanted to emphasize the artistic value of their work. But now, let's dive into the glaziers' pattern books, and I will take these 3 masterpieces as starting point. As earlier said, in Belgium, I know of 4 glaziers pattern books, or rather said 4 sets of drawings of glazing motifs. And one set is kept at the City Archives of Mechelen. It probably originates from the 17th century, and it contains 130 drawings. And to give you an impression of what the book looks like, I show you some of the pages. Then there is the Musea Brugge. It has 2 sets in its collection, both dating from the first half of the 18th century and together containing 208 drawings. Again, I show you some of the pages. And then the 4th set regards the Ulrix manuscript. According to some written entries, it was made and used in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And in this book are assembled 77 drawings. According to the few notes in it, a certain Severinus Ulrix had made the drawings. And the book was owned by a Lambrecht van der Locht in 1691. And some further inscriptions indicate that the book was used till at least 1730. Both Severinus Ulrix and Lambrecht van der Locht were glaziers. Severinus probably originated from Tongeren, but moved to Hasselt, where he started a dynasty of glaziers which would stay operative for more than a century. And of Lambrecht is known that he was a member of Smithscraft in Hasselt, in which the glaziers too were joined. So most likely Lambrecht had asked Severinus to compose the book for him. But then judging by the calculations, fragments of invoices and references to clients and orders, the book was a working instrument. The designs in it must have served as inspiration for the glazier or as a catalog for his clients. Regarding the repetitive patterns, this idea seems logic. Nevertheless, it is less obvious for what purpose this kind of book contained models of masterpieces as well. So this is a question I'm struggling with myself. Well, now you're wondering why this cross is still visible on the screen. Well, I just wanted to show you something interesting about it. A similar cross was namely drawn in the Mechelen pattern book, which you can see here. And even more interesting is that the Royal Museums of Art and History in Brussels have this panel in their collection. Where it comes from and what was its function, however, is not clear. But it shows that the same drawings can be found in several pattern books, that the design was spread and known over a large region. But when we return to these executed masterpieces of Bruges, Louvain, and Leiden, and when we compare these to the drawings of Mechelen, Bruges, and the Ulrix manuscript, we can find many parallels and even copies. And in this table, I have arranged in the first column the masterpieces, and in the second, third, and fourth column, I have arranged the drawings from the pattern books corresponding to these masterpieces. So each row shows the matching drawings in each pattern book, although there are much more overlaps to find in these books. Moreover, there is also proof that several of these drawings have really served as a model for masterpieces. And when you have this page, here you have above the inscription Preuve de Camerec. Preuve reminds us of the French word épreuve, which is well, the masterpiece. And then Camerec is the place, Cambrai, the city of Cambrai, which was it's now in France, but until the 17th century, it was in the southern Low Countries. And then here you have this page, or you have here another version of this drawing, and it says Preuve Antwerpia. And indeed, in the central zone, you can see the shield of the city of Antwerp. So it was a masterpiece executed in Antwerp. Then similar relationships between pattern books can also be noticed among the more simple drawings, even though we can still see some variations. For instance, on the second row, we see a more straight variation here and a more curvy variation of the same motif. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that the same kinds of patterns were known and used over a large region, maybe after they had been imported by traveling or immigrating glaziers, or maybe they circulated through publications. For example, these and other patterns are related to drawings we find in André Philibin's book of 1676, and then a century later they were still known by Pierre Levier. And here you have the names both authors gave to these patterns. And here you see both the title pages of the publications. Philibin was an architect, Levier was a glazier, and so was their respective public. Further overlaps with the Netherlandish manuscripts can also be found in other publications, such as a book of sundry draughts. This is actually the oldest book I know in which is presented a whole series of lead patterns. It was written by the Englishman Walter Gedde and printed in London in 1650. Further, I know nothing about this Walter Gedde, but it can be suspected that he was a glazier. This book consists of 4 parts, of which the last part is about glass painting, and the title is The Manner How to Anneal or Paint in Glass. So this is the front page of that final chapter. And the first three chapters are collected all kinds of lead patterns. And here you have some examples. Goethe himself wrote that glaziers could use his drawings as an inspiration when designing leaded panels, but in his title he also referred to plasterers and gardeners, which you can see here. Several patterns are indeed known from stucco work on historical ceilings, while others recall floor tiles, basket weaving, parquet flooring, or other handicrafts. After all, it is not uncommon to see the same motifs pop up at several places in several art forms or materials. But we're all talking about glass panels. And what I wanted to show you is that several of the patterns in Goethe reappear in the Netherlandish pattern books. And here you see two of them with their counterparts in the Mechelen pattern book. And these examples can be supplemented by some of the drawings that come from another book. And this is the so-called Oran manuscript. Indeed, it is a pattern book made by a glazier, in this case, in the 18th century Parisian glazier called Oran. And then here you see some more examples of the drawings he made with everyday repeated motifs. However, the Oran manuscript contains masterpieces as well, such as these, and there is even a design of a cross. But although similarities can be found with the Netherlandish masterpieces, there are no exact copies. And maybe this indicates a less intensive exchange of glaziers, ideas, and practices between Paris and the Low Countries. And then a last example that I was able to take a closer look at is a treatise about leaded windows of the Royal Monastery of the Holy Virgin of Guadeloupe. And this manuscript is dated in the middle of the 17th century and gives instructions on how to make a leaded panel. It contains about 50 drawings of lead patterns, which we can classify as everyday geometrical patterns. It starts with very easy patterns, such as simple squares. Others are more elaborate. Like this, but none of the designs is what we would classify as a masterpiece. The purpose of this document was in the first place to instruct the monks of the monastery of Guadeloupe how to make and repair their own windows. It was not really a commercial instrument. And the author laid strong emphasis, for instance, on how to cut the glass, how to solder, and he told his readers or pupils to use every material very sparingly up to the smallest piece of glass. And then to end this presentation, I show you here the glaziers pattern books I discussed, or letting out the published treatises. That as you see, this collection of manuscripts is very limited, but its study has proven to be most interesting as they give direct information about the guild system and the glazier's profession. And like the other pattern books known in Belgium, the Ulrix manuscript dates from a period that saw many changes in the market for stained and leaded windows. In the 17th and 18th centuries, churches as well as secular buildings were less glazed with colorful stained glass windows, and on the contrary, they became increasingly glazed with clear glass. And with regard to the leaded panels, the variety in lead patterns knew a real boom. As the client's wishes changed, the guild's practices responded to this. And then with respect to the masterpiece, the emphasis on glass painting reduced, while the technical aspects of the glazing became the main point of attention. Of course, it would be wonderful if further study of this kind of pattern books would lead to new insights, and maybe some of you know of other examples of such manuscripts. As for my own research, I am interested to further investigate the interaction between clear glass lead patterns and stained glass, how the relationship between these two domains changed, to what extent these practices were based on tradition, and in what way they evolved and modernized. So now I just want to thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisbeth. Really extraordinary kind of introduction to a rich topic, and a pleasure to see illustrations of manuscripts that most of us just wouldn't get a chance to see, and to have it explained so fully. So thank you so much. Are you happy to take questions? Yeah.
Yes, I hope I can answer them.
Those of you joining us, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There's also a chat function. It's helpful for us if you put the questions in the Q&A, but please do put your questions in there, and we'll be able to ask Lisbeth your questions. As chair and host of the evening, I'll kick off with a couple while you're thinking up of your questions. And firstly, just wondered if you could say a bit more about the fact that obviously clear glass lets in more light, and you had some really interesting quotes. One of whom I forget who said it, but mentioned the heavenly light. Could you say more about the use of clear glass and maybe the religious practices at the time, thinking especially about the rise of Protestantism across Europe at that time, but especially in the Low Countries?
Well, I mentioned the Counter-Reformation and the fact that a lot of artwork in churches was destroyed, including stained glass. And that was then a reason afterwards sometimes to remove stained glass and to replace it with clear glass. And I don't know what you mean with more religious use of glass.
I think the light, especially when we talk about medieval coloured and stained glass, and the fact that it's coloured light is so important in that medieval mindset, it seems, or at least people like Panofsky have argued that. So I wondered about this more pure light and whether that had any additional kind of religious significance at the time, or whether it was just a kind of aesthetic preference.
Well, maybe I'm not the best person to ask this question, but indeed, well, light as such was a form of the divine, and light that goes through glass. It is indeed well the divine that can be seen and touched. That's true. Okay, that was just a Q&A. But whether it was more divine to have clear glass than colored glass, that at the moment I don't know how to answer on that.
Thank you. And related to that, you showed the paintings that we're all very familiar with those glazing in the background, and they're often interiors of chapels or houses. Do you have a sense that these pattern books were used for both ecclesiastical and domestic contexts, or more one than the other?
I think more in churches than in regular and normal houses. Well, when we look at paintings, there are some designs that are more that recur more often than others. such as the types that I showed, the Losange, the Flemish Renaissance. Also, you have to keep in mind that the more fancy the lead pattern was, the more expensive it would have been to make. So, and also these really fancy lead patterns were, as I understand it, more used in churches.
Thank you. One of our attendees has commented on the question about light, and says, was the rise of clear glass alongside Protestantism perhaps in part due to the rising importance of scripture and the need for more legibility and reading? So a good point.
Yes, indeed. That's indeed so. Now I'm a bit confused by all the questions. And indeed, it is said that in Cistercian abbeys, there was a greater tendency to have clear glass windows, because in these abbeys, or in the churches of these abbeys, there were no normal people who couldn't read, and only the monks, the sisters of the abbey themselves, who could read and therefore needed enough light to read, and they didn't need the painted saints to know what their religion was all about. So that's indeed something that is said. Yeah.
And you showed some early kind of Cistercian glass at the beginning. Heather asks, well, she comments that the 12th century design is incredibly complicated for something so early, and that's true of a lot of the Cistercian glass of that period, I think, which is perhaps the most documented clear leaded glass windows that I know of, certainly.
Yeah, they are indeed. Well, complicated, they exist, so they weren't too complicated for the glaziers of that time. But yeah.
Okay, Anna asks, were glaziers aware of Islamic geometric designs?
I don't know what they knew about Islamic. Well, I wouldn't. Why not? But that's not something that I have studied. I haven't studied the relationship between. No, that not. But
it's an interesting question in relation to geometry, because I think we're very guilty of thinking of windows in churches as being figurative, full stop. And of course, geometry was very important in that medieval church, and clearly in the kind of 17th and 18th centuries, as you have demonstrated. So some of those geometric patterns may have had some additional symbolic meanings.
Yes, about the divine geometry. Yes, it could be. But as you see, there is still a lot of, especially for me, to learn about this topic. This was just a side project of my PhD, so I'm not an expert on the type and the meaning, especially not the meaning of these patterns. So
and there's never a definitive answer, is it, about, with meanings? I think we're always tempted to find meaning in pattern, and sometimes pattern is pattern, and sometimes it's practical. On a practical note, looking at the manuscripts, is there a kind of uniform size of these panels? Can you tell that from the designs? Are they designs? Are they cartoons? Are they the direct one-to-one scale?
That I have them here. I don't know if there are a lot of. Well, I will show it to you. I don't know if you will see it. Well, Do you see it like this?
Yeah, if you hold it back a bit more. Bring it back towards, yeah, that's it, yeah.
And you can see that there are inscriptions here. And I can, it's not centimeters or something, but they're all about the same size. All the pages are all about the same size. But here I don't see any, well, there is no reference to a scale or something, but they are all about, well, the same size. And yes, most or a lot of panels, like in houses, in the windows of houses, are also about the same size.
Yeah.
But more about the size isn't, I can't tell you of these windows. But of course, we have the executed masterpieces, which also give an indication of the size. I don't know by heart what was the size, but I can maybe, if I have it here with me, no.
Well, it seems there's definitely a kind of standardization.
60, 70 centimeters is one size. Yeah.
Penny asks another question about the Ulrix manuscript. So who was the seller and where is it now? Is it in a public or a private collection?
Now it's in a private collection. The seller, I don't know who the seller was, but I asked the auction house who bought it, and well, then I was in contact with the current owner, and I asked him if I could see the manuscript. I said, well, I'm doing some research on clear window glass, and I'm interested to know more about these well, clear glass designs. And he said, oh yes, you can see it. Well, you can have the pictures of it if you write me a text about it. So that was our deal. I didn't see it in, actually, I didn't have it in my hands, but I have nice pictures of it, so I'm happy.
Well, it sounds like you both benefited from that.
Yes, but the goal of the current owner was indeed to have it published. And so that's what I was looking at. Now we have this book with all the
fantastic,
all the pages in it.
Brilliant.
So everybody can see it thanks to this book.
And we'll make sure we get the title of the book for those of you who are asking about that. Someone was asking to see if the patterns were available. And it does sound like some of them are published, so that's fantastic.
Yes, okay. The patterns of Mechelen and Bruges aren't publicly available at the moment. I think they are working on it in Mechelen. In Bruges, I don't know. No.
A question from Suzanne. Do you know any more about the life of Walter Guédé?
No. I just found one article about him that also told that he was probably a glazier. But I can give you the title, or I can look it up. The article I can give you reference, but that's all.
Yeah, I think he's fairly well known and cited in the UK. The Stained Glass Museum actually did have a copy of that manuscript, but it was stolen. So it went
stolen.
Yeah, it was stolen 15 years ago. So if anyone sees a copy on the auction or something, please do let us know, because we don't know where it went, but it was clearly deliberately taken. Lita asks, could you tell us about how your interest in this topic started?
Well, my first interest was stained glass. I don't know if you want to hear this story, but I studied art history, and then I had to decide on what topic I would write my thesis. And I was hesitating whether I would write something about paintings, and then, oh no, something about architecture. I wasn't sure what to do. And then actually one morning I woke up and I knew it had to be something that combines the two and was stained glass. And then I did afterwards the conservation and restoration of stained glass. And well, and then some years ago, I was working as a journalist, and my what would become my supervisor asked me if I was interested to do a project on clear glass, and I did this project, and from that project came then the PhD. So that's
a very typical story, I think.
Very typical story
as well.
Yes, and for this this project, I did some research in archives, and I went to, I don't know if you know the Museum Plantain Moretus in Antwerp. Plantain Moretus was a well-known publishers family in Antwerp, and their house and workshop still exists in Antwerp, and is now a museum, and they have a lot of archives. And I studied the glaziers invoices, and these glaziers invoices, that's a bunch of papers, of documents of the glaziers who worked for the family. And it was so interesting to see how these glaziers made notes of everything they did for the family, in what houses, because the family had different houses, in what house, in what room in the house, whether they installed new panels or whether they did some maintenance work, and what kind of glass they used. And in these archives, you see that they used, during several centuries, but that they used over 10 different types of clear window glass, which is, when you think of what we use now as window glass, we just have float glass. But this case alone proves that window glass in the past was so interesting. So
well, thank you, because you've certainly shown us that this evening. It's been an extraordinary insight to, as I said, a topic that most of us haven't given much thought to, but you've demonstrated what rich sources there are out there, and really wonderfully explained those to us this evening. And I'm sure that we'll all be walking past historic buildings looking at that plain glass with more interest than we have previously, because there is a variety of mouth-blown clear glass out there, pre-clear glass, and it definitely looks different and more pleasant, I think, to look.
Yes. So in England, there is still a lot of historical clear window glass to see, and more crown glass, and that here it is very rare to see crown glass. When I see crown glass here, I'm just thrilled.
Fantastic. Well, we will be putting together any resources that we find and books that were mentioned, and we will send that to those of you who have joined us this evening in case you want to read more about it. But thank you so much, Lisbeth, for a fascinating talk. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening, which is the last of our autumn talks. So please do go to the Stained Glass Museum website and join our mailing list if you're not already, to find out what talks and other events we have coming up. It's always great to hear from experts, especially from abroad. So thank you so much, Lisbeth, who I know is an hour ahead of us, so it's later in her evening than it is for us. Thank you, everyone. Good night.